The rain began as she walked into the city, dress clinging to knees that had known too many miles. They named her Anaya after the receipt was signed. No one asked where she'd come from. The rich family she ended up with owned a house the size of a small village and a sorrow the size of oceans. Mr. Haroon, the billionaire, used to walk like a man who owned his future. A crash took his legs and left him boxed in silence. Anaya scrubbed floors, folded linen, and learned not to take up space. She learned other things too, which Herbs the gardener whispered about: how to stitch a wound without asking for permission, how to hum across a room so the sound could enter a sleeping chest. The household ran on schedules and secrets. The wife kept her face polished for social proofs. The children kept their laughter for parties. No one knew what to do with the quiet that crept out of Mr. Haroon. One night he coughed, deep and frightened, and Anaya, holding a tray of medicine, placed her hand on his shoulder and hummed a tune that smelled of porridge and kindness. He tightened his fingers on the cup as if remembering a map. The household took notice because the impossible in that house was noticing anything at all. She began to sit near him. She read to him from a dog-eared book of stories, fed him tea at odd hours, massaged his calves with oil she learned from the gardener. The staff called it a flare of attention. The wife called it impertinence. The children called it something akin to magic. Mr. Haroon started to ask for more of her presence, for stories, for tea, for the small, steady confidence that someone could be trusted to keep another's corners tidy. When rehab by the sea was suggested, the daughter made arrangements and the crew packed their hopes into suitcases. Therapists measured progress in exercises and tiny victories. Mr. Haroon refused to stand for days. Anaya sat with him on a bench that watched the waves and spoke about feet like they were old friends, stubborn, faithful, needing only a small nudge to remember their work. She taught him how to feel sand beneath a toe, how the surf nudged a calf awake. The therapist frowned and wrote notes. The charts crept upward. On a bright morning, he pushed himself up with trembling legs. He fell and laughed at his own surprise. The staff applauded with the kind of relief that sounds like rain after drought. The wife watched, unraveling and not quite understanding she was being rewritten. Home returned them to rooms that smelled of lemon polish and power. He could walk the garden sometimes, cane clicking like a punctuation. He smiled in a newspaper picture that spoke of recovery and modern care. But the true change was private. Coffee prepared and shared, stories exchanged at dusk, the daughter learning to dig her fingers into soil without gloves. Then came a legal meeting. A business partner with hands mapped in contracts suggested moving assets, tightening control. He spoke the language of balance sheets and quiet theft. The daughter rose, voice steady in a way she hadn't known she owned, and declared that whatever they took would not strip away the man her father had become. The partner left uncertain. Mr. Haroon, with a small grown-up kindness, offered Anaya a new life. He refused to simply sign a check for her family. Instead, he offered payment and education, a place in the rehab programs as a caregiver, classes at night to study medicine and anatomy. He turned the gift of gratitude into something that would let her keep her name. Anaya accepted. She left the house with a tin of tea and a scarf, the daughter pressing a worn book into her hand and the wife folding the silver a little slower that day. At the community college, she learned to read charts and bandage with care instead of haste. Years softened the sharpness of being bought. Dignity grew in the small increments of learning and being paid a fair wage. The rehabilitation center they founded became a place where people who had fallen into the city's cracks came to practice standing. Anaya, once invisible, taught new caregivers how to hum across hospital rooms and how to listen to someone's fear as if it were a map. Mr. Haroon visited patients and sponsored programs. Sometimes he walked without a cane, sometimes with it like an old friend. Anaya's life widened in ways that did not feel like spectacle. Mr. Haroon helped her siblings find steady work. A small fund was set aside to pay for apprenticeships and classes. The gesture was careful, no grand announcements, only opportunities that required effort, study, and steady attendance. The house adjusted in slow fits. The wife never became a heroine overnight, but she and Anaya learned to share tasks and sometimes, awkwardly, conversation. The rehabilitation center grew. It remained humble but persistent, a place where people who had been discarded could relearn small tasks and also be taught dignity. Anaya taught classes about touch and listening. She wrote short guides for volunteers about the little things that make care human. Papers and journals took notice of the center's results, but the measures that mattered were quieter: a patient making tea on his own, a parent learning to bandage a child's scraped knee. There were battles. The partner who had wanted to tighten control continued to press in corridors of finance. Legal challenges came, and the center had to defend itself with petitions and paperwork and community support. Those fights taught everyone that repair includes protecting what you build. Anaya fell in love quietly with a teacher at the center. They married beneath a fig tree with mismatched chairs and little ceremony. The daughter married too, and she asked Anaya to be part of their small celebrations instead of a servant called only when useful. Gradually, the old power dynamic softened until the mansion smelled less of polish and more of soup and ordinary life. Anaya kept a notebook of firsts: the first class she taught, the first time she was paid for her care, the first patient who came back to hug her after learning to walk. She used those dates like a map to see how far she had come. Sometimes she returned to the rooms where she had once slept, not to mourn but to remember how hunger shaped her. She would stand by the window with a cup and watch the city move on: vendors balancing crates, children racing puddles, couples hurrying with umbrellas. The center published manuals on compassionate caregiving. Anaya's essays, sincere, were included. They read like letters to strangers: listen, be steady, do not assume. Nurses and volunteers translated them into workshops, and slowly practices spread to other clinics. People learned that medicine and kindness are not opposites but companions. On anniversaries, she kept cups of tea on windowsills and gave thanks in small ways. People who had been helped returned to volunteer. Children once waiting became the ones giving. Mr. Haroon used his influence to secure funding while keeping the center autonomous. He opened doors rather than signed checks that put others in his shadow. What happened next was the slow work of many hands. There was no dramatic reversal that erased the past. Instead, there were incremental changes: a man learning to walk and choosing to teach others, a family reconfigured by small acts of respect, a former maid who became a teacher of care. Anaya's name stopped being shorthand for pity and began to mean a method: the patient, ordinary kindness that insists a person matters. If anyone wanted a single lesson, she would say this: healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in steady attention, in opportunities given instead of pity, in education and mutual work. It arrives when someone chooses to stand beside another and to teach them to stand for themselves. Years later, when the city had rearranged its traffic and its markets, a young woman with rain on her skirt came to the center asking for a chance. Anaya saw her own tired hands and offered a cup of tea and a place to learn.